Hey, geography students. We are going to be moving on to our second part of this unit, which is about urbanization. And as we've talked about in the past, we have two major types of human settlement. We classify them in rural and urban. Rural being one more of a low population density, very few people live in the area, whereas urbanized areas are classified by higher population density. Right, so that would include mostly things like cities and surrounding areas where we have a lot of people living in one single geographic area. So how do we tell where the urban populations are located on Earth versus suburban? Well, the easiest way to do it, in my opinion, is to just turn on the lights. So as you can see here in this image, this is a satellite view of the world from space at night. And as you can clearly see, the most populated areas are going to have high levels of light output, right? So, this would come from large amounts of artificial, human-made electric lighting. And so those are naturally going to be the highest in areas where there are large populations and high density of people, right? So that much light being emitted. And you can see that clearly from space. Some of the trends you might notice is that more developed countries are going to have higher amounts of urban centers. So like large amounts of cities. So like in the U.S., the eastern U.S. especially, as well as around the coastlines. That's one of the general patterns that we can notice is that a lot of large settlements occurs along the coast of major parts of the world, right? Along oceans or other major bodies of water. And then there's also things that we can't see here that tells us some too, right? Places where there isn't much light tells us that it's more of a rural population and low population density, such as in large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Central and South America. Part of this deals with geographic features as well, though, right? So we have large amounts of dense rainforest in Central Africa and the Amazon here in South America. We have the Sahara Desert, the Himalayas, large mountain range with Mount Everest here in Asia, and those types of factors play a part as well. So, those types of factors are certainly indicative of why people settle in certain locations, but there's other things playing a part too. So let's take a look at some of the patterns we can ascertain from this. Now, we talked about what rural versus urban is, right? But the general trend is that people have been, for the past couple hundred years, that is, moved from rural to urban areas. And this goes back to what we talked about in previous lessons. This is primarily caused by the industrialization process, right? People are moving out of rural areas where they would work agricultural jobs and into more urban areas where they'd work factory or service-based jobs in the secondary or tertiary sectors. And so as countries industrialize, the quality of life and the development in that country improves, they're going to move to urban centers, right? Either urban cities or suburban surrounding areas. This has been the general trend ever since the original Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. And as countries go through those 5 stages of Rostow's stages of development and industrialization, the trend continues. To give you an example and to illustrate this trend, only 3% of all the world's population or people alive in 1800 lived in an urban area or city. Fast forward 100 years, and 14% of people lived in urban areas, especially in the industrialized countries. And now today, it's upwards of 55% now. Okay, and we're growing at about 1.84% every 5 years. So every 5 years, we have close to 2% of the population that moves from rural to urban areas around the world. And that's primarily in more developed countries. You can see that here, 75% of the most developed countries like the US, Britain, Japan, Australia, those types of countries have large amounts of urban population. Whereas in lesser developed countries, they haven't gone through the industrialization process. There's no need to live in cities because they still need to, earn a living by working in agricultural jobs or the primary sector. And so they need more space and live in the rural areas more spread out. Okay, but that trend will continue in the future as more and more countries industrialize and more countries urbanize as a direct correlation. Now, as the cities themselves develop and grow, population statistics and urban geographers have developed this system of hierarchy or ranking system to help identify and classify different sizes and types of urban settlements. The smallest of which is called a hamlet, and as it grows, it grows in complexity and as well as population into what they call a village, and then larger cities larger settlements become a town and then a city. And the city grows and grows and grows, and sometimes they grow at such a rate that they sprawl outwards, and they maybe even sprawl and get so large to connect to other surrounding cities. A good example of this phenomenon, known as a megalopolis, is what they call Boswash, right? And so this is an amalgamation of the cities of Boston and Washington to denote the upper and lower extremities of this region. And what all they're saying here is that Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and ending in Washington, D.C., have grown so large individually that they've kind of run together. And so if you drove from Boston to Washington and back, you might not notice that anything has really changed in terms of urbanization. Because they're so big, they've grown together, and it's become one large megalopolis in a way, right? Where it's a large urban population that have grown together. And so we're talking about millions and millions and millions of people that live in this stretch of the country that's relatively close together. Right, so that's the general trend that's happening around the world as countries develop and urbanize as a result. All right, so just a quick map here to show you what's going on. Countries that are more urbanized tend to also be more developed. So we see, the United States and Canada, as well as European countries. Some countries in Oceania and the like are more urbanized as they've industrialized as well. All right, so we can see this in this chart as well, that Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Anglo-Americas, and the U.S. and Canada are more developed countries, as we learned from our HDI portion of the unit. And they are also, as you can tell here on the scale, a higher percentage of urban areas, like people that live in urban areas. And then, of course, in the lesser developed parts of the world, such as Latin America, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, they have less and less people that work in cities or live in cities because they are working agricultural jobs. They have not industrialized to the same rate yet, and live in more rural areas instead. All right, so let's make sure that we understand what exactly we're talking about when we talk about a city. And most of you are probably familiar with the general term, but let's make sure that we have a clear understanding of what exactly makes up a city. A city is a nucleated settlement, as in there is a central point that extends outwards, and people live in the surrounding areas. The actual center point of a city is typically known as the central business district. So this is what you think of when you think of the skyscrapers of a city, right? The tall buildings, the center where there's large office buildings where lots of people work and travel to, and land is at a premium, so they can't build outwards. It's too expensive. You need more land, so they build upwards instead. And so that's why you see these large city centers and urban populations. So the central business district is that center area of the city where there's large skyscrapers and office buildings. And then in the surrounding areas, you have adjacent businesses like services, maybe some factories around the outside edges. You have restaurants and shops that are further out, as well as housing, right? Housing and other types of businesses are located around the central business district, okay? They tend to be a very diverse population in cities. You get lots of different people from all different parts of the world that tend to migrate to cities because if you think about it, we talked about this in our migration unit. When you move to a country, most likely the new immigrant is going to move to a city because that's where jobs are located. You see a large amount of people from very rich to very poor, all different races, nationalities, especially in the US and other similar countries in the cities themselves. They tend to have their own government and large, economy themselves, and they usually have a large amount of mass transit or public transportation, such as subways, buses, and other types of similar transportation activities. And this allows for a smoother transition and allows people to move from their homes to work more easily. Now, as we look at the fact that cities are not all the same, especially in terms of population, we've learned some patterns as to how these cities grow. Like, why are some cities larger than others? Well, one is because the fact that they have more jobs or they're more centrally located. Maybe it's a capital city. There's other factors, all kinds of factors that contribute to this. But we do classify cities with more than 10 million or more residents in their metropolitan statistical area, or their MSA, as megacities. And all that means, that MSA means, is that not only in the city limits itself, but like the surrounding suburbs together, right? People that maybe they don't live in New York City itself, but they live in a surrounding suburb and drive into the city for work or business or pleasure. And for various reasons, they are counted as towards the city's MSA population. Okay. So you don't just have to live in downtown Manhattan in a large building and to be considered living in New York. You could live in one of the suburbs as well. All right, so those are mega cities, 10 million or more residents in the MSA. And then we classify certain places as either being primate or rank size rule, following the rank size rule in countries. In some countries, they have one single city that is so much larger in population than the other cities for various different reasons. But basically, it has to be more than double of the next largest city in terms of population. So a couple of examples include Mexico City in Mexico, Seoul in South Korea, and a few others. But the key primary reason for all these is because these particular cities have some significance, especially economically, of importance that leads them to being where people flock to, you might say. Okay, so that's a primate city, but then some countries don't have one single city that has way more population than others. We do notice in some countries, such as Germany, that they follow the rank size rule, where they have the largest city is, of the largest population is about just over double the next city's population. So, for instance, like you see, Berlin has 4 million people. The next largest city, Hamburg, has 2 million people. And then the next largest city is 1/3 the size of the largest city of Berlin, Munich, at 1.25. And then Cologne's 1/4 of the size of Berlin. And it goes in this general pattern, right? It keeps getting progressively smaller, right? But there's no one single city that's way, way, way bigger than all the rest of them. All right. So to give you an example, Mexico City has about 12.2 million people in its MSA. Next largest city there is Tapalapa. I'm not good at pronouncing that one, sorry. Is at 1.9 million. And so therefore it follows the primate city rule, not the rank size rule. So you have more than double, way more than double the next largest city in Mexico City versus the second largest city in Mexico is Iztapalapa at only 1.9. Okay. All right. And then lastly, we see that the general trend in the modern day U.S. especially is that the cities are moving outwards. They're no longer just growing upwards; they're growing outwards to include more and more people. And this is in large part due to the automobile making it easy for transportation in and out of the city, and people wanting to move out of the city to raise families, have more land, to cleaner areas to live in, and things like that. So suburbanization is a large reason for this urban sprawl and is not necessarily the case in many other countries. But in the United States in particular, it's very common for suburbs to pop up all around these major cities. So that's why we use the MSA. So to give you an example, Columbia, South Carolina, has a MSA of roughly 837,000 people, right? And only 134,000 of those actually live in downtown, what they call the Columbia city limits. The rest live in the surrounding areas, such as Lexington, Casey, Irmo, Camden, Saluda, Blythewood, and Chapin, and many others that aren't listed here. But and I know it doesn't all add up to 837,000. So if you were trying to do that, don't worry. There's just a bunch of stuff that's not listed here. But to give you an idea of what it looks like. All right, so these places end up leading to the fact that Columbia is the city center, and that's where a lot of people travel to for work. But they live in these surrounding areas, these suburbs. And so altogether, though, it makes up this larger unit called a metropolitan area. Okay, so the Columbia metro area is all these different places included, and they have a connection though to that central city, especially that central business district we talked about. All right, and for instance, an MSA is an urban population with at least 50,000 people that live there. Okay, it may be one city, it may be multiple cities, that are close in geographic terms, but ultimately, it's not only the actual city itself, but also the surrounding suburbs and areas altogether. What this causes is urban sprawl, or the cities to grow outwards, right, away from that city point, central point of the city. All right, here's what that kind of looks like, and this is something that's relatively uncommon in other parts of the world. For instance, this is Atlanta. Look how large geographically it is. It has a city center here of Atlanta downtown itself, but then so many people live in the surrounding areas in these black dot areas, that indicates population and how built up it is. Compare that to Barcelona, which actually has more people, but look how small it is compared to Atlanta. Right, Barcelona in Spain has a lot of people living in it, but it's much more built up and vertically rather than horizontally. Right, they're more spread out in Atlanta, and this is the general trend in American cities where you have more space and allows for automobiles to take people out to further areas. Whereas in Barcelona and other countries around the world, they have less automobile uses, and people tend to live closer and closer to the city and not use automobiles so much as they do subways and other types of public transportation, and that causes them to live closer and closer. All right, so this urban sprawl is more of an American trend rather than around the world. All right, and the last thing I'm going to take a look at today is this this quick video. All right, we're going to look at some of the large megacities of today in the world, the top 10 that you should know, and what they look like. So here you go.
Do you live in a megacity? Yeah, that's a real. Do you live in a megacity? Yeah, that's a real term. It's used to describe a metropolis with over 10 million residents. Right now, there are 28 megacities in the world with about 450 million inhabitants among them. The most densely populated areas can have an average of more than 100,000 people per square mile. So, what are some of the largest cities in the world? Well, when we talk about largest cities, we're usually talking about the number of inhabitants. There are many organizations that rank cities, but for this video, we're relying on 2014 data from the United Nations. Cities in Asia have dominated the top 10 list for a long time now. On the very top, by a long shot, is Tokyo, Japan, with about 38 million people. Tokyo has been the most populous megacity since about 1955, and it will likely remain that way until sometime after 2030. After Tokyo, 3 other Asian cities dominate the top of the ranks: Delhi, Shanghai, and Mumbai. Out of all the people living in urban areas in the world, 53% reside in Asian cities. Before Tokyo grew so large, New York City in the United States was the most populous city from the 1920s to the 1950s. However, today, NYC barely makes the top 10 list. To the south, Mexico City in Mexico and Sao Paulo in Brazil comprise other non-Asian metropolises. The world's largest cities are sometimes measured in terms of population density and land size. Asian cities, again, are at the top of these rankings. City sizes in square miles tend to vary dramatically, but China's Shanghai and Beijing are reportedly among the largest land-wise, as is Pakistan's Karachi. Then, cities like Manila in the Philippines and Dhaka in Bangladesh reportedly have some of the highest population densities in the world. Dhaka, according to a report by Demographia, has more than 15 million people living on just 139 square miles of land. And that breaks down to about 100,000 people per square mile. For the past 6 decades, urban cities like these have seen unprecedented growth. In 2007, for the first time ever, the global urban population outnumbered the global rural population, and the trends are expected to continue. By 2050, the UN predicts about 2/3 of the world will be living in urban cities, and by that time, there could be 13 additional megacities prospering around the globe. Languages, like cities, are one of the most interesting ways to study how people interact.